Okay, get ready because we're diving into a really unsettling story today. It's about Dorothea Puente, the death house landlady. When you think serial killer, you might feature someone, really sinister looking. But Puente wasn't like that at all. Imagine a sweet, grandmotherly type running a boarding house, right? Now imagine that same person is behind a string of murders going on for decades, and she targeted the most vulnerable people. Are you getting chills yet?
Yeah, it's really the contrast, the contrast between her public image and the reality of what she was doing that gets me. This wasn't a crime of passion or anything like that. It was so calculated, methodical, and it's extra chilling because she was preying on people who completely trusted her.
Right, exactly. And that's what we're going to look at today. How did she fool everyone for so long? What would drive someone to do something so horrible? And what does this case tell us about the darkness that can be hidden in plain sight?
We're going to be looking at Puente's past, including her really tough childhood, but it's important to remember that none of that excuses her action.
Of course, of course.
It's more like putting together a puzzle, right? We need all the pieces to get the full picture.
Absolutely. So let's start at the very beginning. Dorothea Helen Gray, born in California in 1929. Her early life was, well, really difficult. Alcoholic parents, losing her father when she was young, and then the trauma of being abused in an orphanage.
Those early experiences, they must have had a huge impact on her. Even as a teenager, she was forging checks. That kind of deception, it's like a mirror of what she'd do later to her victims.
It's like she was practicing.
Maybe. It makes you wonder if it was some twisted way of trying to gain control, after a childhood where she had none.
It does make you wonder.
There's a lot of research that shows early trauma can really mess someone up psychologically. It can lead to problems trusting people, forming healthy relationships, even regulating emotion.
And Puente's choices definitely took a dark turn pretty early on, forging checks as a teenager, ending up in trouble with the law. And that pattern of deceit, it just continued into adulthood. Eventually, she was even running a brothel and pretending it was a bookkeeping business. Clearly, she had a real knack for manipulation.
And a total disregard for the law and for other people. There's this one detail that's really important. After acting erratically, she had a psych evaluation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and the doctors diagnosed her as a pathological liar with an unstable personality.
What does that even mean?
Basically, someone who lies all the time, almost compulsively, even when there's no reason to.
Wow.
And then add to that the unpredictable, volatile behavior, you start to see a pattern that really foreshadows how she'd manipulate her victims later on.
It's like she was developing her skills of deception, step by step.
Yeah.
And speaking of deception, Puente was a master of reinvention, always changing her identity. She's all sorts of different names. Thais Singola, Nearda, Sharon Johansson, and of course the name she became infamous for, Dorothea Puente. She was married a bunch of times too, often using those relationships to get money. Like she was constantly playing a part, never letting anyone see the real her.
Right, always changing, always hiding. I think it points to a deep need to control how people saw her, to create this carefully constructed facade for the world. It's like a magician, right? She's creating this distraction, keeping you focused on the illusion, while she's picking your pocket.
I never thought of it like that. That's a good analogy.
It's classic con artist stuff. Build trust to hide your true intentions. And she was incredible at it.
Yeah, she really was. She built up this image of a devout Christian woman, a caregiver, a pillar of the community. People saw her as someone who dedicated her life to helping people.
And that was the key to her success. That's how she gained the trust of these vulnerable people. They saw her as a lifeline, someone who could give them a safe place. But that safe place was a lie. It was a trap.
And the heart of that crap was her boarding house on F Street in Sacramento. And this is where her story takes a really dark turn. This place was supposed to be a refuge for elderly people, people struggling with mental health, people battling addiction,
A place where they felt welcome and cared for.
or so they thought.
And that's the real horror of it, isn't it? The cold, calculated betrayal.
Ugh, it's just awful.
These were people who depended on her for everything, for basic needs, for companionship, for security. They were at their most vulnerable, and she used that against them.
It's hard to even comprehend, but it gets even worse. Puente wasn't just giving them a place to live. She was drugging them, robbing them, and eventually murdering them.
It's chilling how simple her method was. She'd overdose them, often using drugs they were already prescribed, so it was harder to suspect anything was wrong.
That's so deviant.
Then she'd get rid of the bodies right there on her property. Shallow graves in the backyard, under the gazebo, even encased in concrete.
It's like something out of a nightmare. But we need to talk about the victims, the real people whose lives were stolen. Puente had 9 confirmed victims, and each one had their own story, their own loved ones left behind.
We have to remember them as individuals, not just statistics. People like Malcolm McKenzie, who was robbed of his family heirlooms. Ruth Monroe, who, and this is disturbing, she actually said she was feeling sick before she died.
Oh, no.
And then there's Everson Gilmouth. Puente tried to cover up his murder by writing fake letters to his sister.
Wow, she really thought of everything.
And it is worse, Betty Palmer, whose body was found partially dismembered in the yard. Leona Carpenter, Puente got power of attorney for her right before she died. James Gallup, whose medical care Puente deliberately messed with, leading to his death.
It's just horrifying.
And the list goes on. Vera Martin, who missed her annual birthday call to her daughter, which is actually what raised suspicions. Dorothy Miller, Puente had a carpet cleaner come and remove what he described as foul-smelling slime from her room.
Oh, God.
Imagine being that callous. And then Alvaro Montoya, Puente, made up this whole story about a brother-in-law to explain his disappearance.
It's unbelievable how many people she tricked.
And lastly, there's Benjamin Fink. His body was found wrapped in plastic, covered in absorbent pads, buried under concrete in the yard.
The level of planning, the coldness of it all is just mind-blowing.
It shows just how deep her deception went. She wasn't just reacting in the moment. She was in control every step of the way, making sure they stayed silent, even in death.
But even the most elaborate lies eventually fall apart.
Right, you can't hide forever.
Yeah, no matter how clever you are, eventually the truth comes out.
Right, exactly.
And in Puente's case, it all started with a social worker. This social worker, she started asking questions about a missing resident.
That's interesting.
You know, it would have been so easy for Puente to brush her off, but thankfully this social worker was persistent.
That's lucky.
It really is.
What happened next?
Well, there was also a former resident, a guy named John Sharp. He actually managed to slip a note to the police.
Oh, wow. Risky.
I know, right? The note said, "She wants me to lie to you."
Chilling.
Totally. That note, it was like a bomb went off. Once the police started looking into things, they found a body in her backyard.
Oh, God.
I know.
And then what?
And then they found another one and another one. It was horrific.
It's hard to even imagine.
It made headlines all over the country. And Puente, she knew she was caught, so she tried to run.
Oh, wow. Where'd she go?
She went to Los Angeles, but even then, she couldn't resist manipulating people.
Really?
Yeah, a guy she met at a bar actually ended up tipping off the police. It's like she couldn't help herself.
Wow, that's wild.
It is. So they arrested her, and the trial was massive. Over 150 witnesses, thousands of pieces of evidence, mountains of paperwork.
That's a huge trial.
It was,
What happened?
well, the jury actually deadlocked at first.
Why do you think that was?
I think it was just such a complicated case.
Yeah, I guess so.
The prosecution had to prove she was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, but they didn't have a lot to go on.
Like what?
Well, there were no eyewitnesses to the murders. And the bodies were so decomposed that it was really hard to say exactly how they died.
Oh, I see.
So it was basically a battle of the experts, trying to piece together a puzzle with a lot of missing pieces.
That makes sense.
But eventually, they reached a verdict. Guilty on 3 counts of murder.
Wow.
And she was sentenced to life in prison without parole.
Well, at least there was some justice.
Yeah, but it still leaves you with a lot of questions.
Like what?
Like, how did she get away with it for so long? Was it just her charm? Or were there bigger problems, like with the system itself?
I think it's probably both. She was really good at manipulating people. She knew how to use their kindness against them.
Yeah, she did.
But there were also definitely some failures on the part of institutions that were supposed to protect these people.
What do you mean?
Well, for example, Puente was cashing her victims' Social Security checks. You'd think someone would have noticed that these people were gone, but their money was still coming in.
You'd think so.
It makes you wonder if anyone really knew these people. Were they so isolated that no one even noticed when they disappeared?
That's heartbreaking.
It is, and it points to a bigger issue. The isolation of elderly people, people with mental health problems, they can become invisible, which makes them easy targets.
So it's like they were forgotten by society, and Puente took advantage of that.
Exactly.
I guess what I'm getting at is that we all need to be more aware,
Yeah, definitely.
especially of those who might be vulnerable.
We need to look out for each other.
Absolutely.
We need to know the signs of abuse and exploitation, and we need to speak up if we see something that doesn't seem right.
It's like, if you see something, say something.
Right.
Puente died in prison back in 2011. She was 82.
Okay.
But her case is still fascinating and horrifying to people. There are so many documentaries and true crime shows about her. There's even a cookbook that she wrote herself from prison.
A cookbook.
Yeah, it's called Cooking with a Serial Killer.
Wow, that's disturbing.
It is.
I can see why people are still so interested in her story. There's something about the dark side of human nature that draws us in.
Right.
Maybe we're trying to understand why someone would do such terrible things, or maybe we just want to reassure ourselves that we could never do something like that.
Maybe. But I think there's a fine line between learning from these cases and exploiting them for entertainment.
Oh, for sure.
In Puente's case, I think that line is especially blurry.
How so?
Well, she was actually making money from her crimes.
Really?
Yeah, by selling recipes and artwork from prison,
That does seem exploitative.
doesn't it?
It feels disrespectful to the victims and their families, like their suffering is being turned into a commodity.
Exactly.
And it also creates this weird incentive for other criminals who want to be famous.
That's a good point. So how do we find that balance? How do we learn from these cases without sensationalizing them?
I think the focus should always be on the victims, on seeking justice for them and learning how to prevent this from happening again.
Right.
It's important to remember that behind every headline, every shocking detail, there are real people who have been hurt.
Absolutely.
Their stories deserve to be told with respect.
So what does it all mean? What's the legacy of Dorothea Puente and her House of Horrors?
It's complicated. I mean, it's a story about horror, for sure, but it's also a story about responsibility.
How so?
Well, her crimes showed us that there are weaknesses in our system, weaknesses that allow people to fall through the cracks, and that we need to do more to protect vulnerable people.
It's also a reminder that evil can hide in plain sight, and that we need to be careful about who we trust.
Right.
We have a responsibility to protect each other. We can't just assume someone else will do it.
I agree.
It's not enough to just be aware. We need to take action and create a safer society.
That's a big task.
It is.
But it starts with understanding that anyone can be vulnerable.
That's a good point.
We tend to think of vulnerability as weakness, but anyone can be vulnerable at some point in their lives.
True.
It could be because of illness, age, mental health, money problems, all sorts of things.
And those things can make people more likely to be exploited.
Exactly.
So it's about changing how we think about vulnerability.
Yeah.
Seeing it as something we all experience, not as a flaw.
And that should make us more compassionate and more determined to protect those who need help.
Absolutely.
It's not just about protecting individuals, though. It's about creating communities where everyone feels safe and valued.
Right. Because isolation makes people more vulnerable.
Exactly. When we connect with each other and we look out for each other, we make it much harder for predators to take advantage.
So it's not just about being aware, it's about doing something.
Yes.
About creating a better world.
That might sound overwhelming,
It does.
but it can start with small things.
Like what?
Checking in on an elderly neighbor, volunteering at a shelter, speaking up when you see something wrong.
Those things can make a difference.
They can. Every act of kindness, every time someone speaks out against injustice, it all helps to create a safer, more compassionate world.
It's a group effort.
It is.
We all have a role to play. We've talked about it a lot, but here's the big question for you, our listener. What allowed someone like Puente to fly under the radar for so long? And what can we do as individuals, as a society, to stop this from happening again?
It's a question we need to think about. If we really want to make a safer world, we need to talk about these tough issues.
For sure.
We need to understand the things that allow predators to thrive, and we need to give people the tools to spot the warning signs and speak out.
Well said. It's about awareness, empathy, and action. We can't just sit back and assume it's someone else's problem.
Yeah, we can't be complacent.
We all have a part to play in protecting our communities.
And it starts with realizing that vulnerability can show up anywhere. We tend to think of it as weakness, but even the strongest people can be vulnerable sometimes.
That's true.
Illness, getting older, mental health struggles, money problems, all sorts of things can make people more vulnerable to being taken advantage of.
So it's about changing how we view vulnerability. Not as a weakness, but as a shared human experience.
Right.
And that should make us want to protect those who need help.
Exactly. It's not just about protecting individuals, though. It's about building communities where everyone feels seen and heard.
Yeah, because isolation makes people easy targets.
When we connect with each other, when we take care of each other, it's a lot harder for predators to operate.
So we need to be aware, but we also need to act.
Yeah, we have to do something.
Create a better world.
It sounds daunting,
It does.
but even small things can help.
Small things. Like what?
Checking in on your elderly neighbors, volunteering at a shelter, saying something when you see something that seems off.
Right, those little things add up.
Every act of kindness, every time someone speaks up against injustice, it all makes a difference.
It's a collective effort.
It is.
We all have a responsibility. This deep dive into Dorothea Puente's world has been pretty heavy, but I think it's also been important.
I agree.
Her story shows us how dark things can hide beneath the surface, but it also shows the power of connection and collective action.
We can't just be bystanders. We have to be active in protecting our communities. We have to speak up for those who are vulnerable. And we have to create a world where everyone feels safe.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand these cases, the better we can prevent them. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.